The man from Gladiator never existed, not really. Maximus Decimus Meridius is a perfect machine of myth, the loyal general, the betrayed servant of a dying emperor, the father and husband driven by private vengeance, the slave who rises through blood and spectacle to challenge the empire itself. It is elegant, it is cinematic, it is unforgettable, and almost all of it is invention. But the truth, hidden underneath, is more brutal, and in a deeper sense, far greater. Because behind that fictional ghost stands a real Roman, whose life was not about personal revenge at all. It was about something colder, larger, and more frightening: the survival of civilization on the edge of collapse. His name was Marcus Nonius Macrinus. He was no gladiator. He was no rustic outsider dragged reluctantly into power. He was an aristocrat, a strategist, a senior imperial commander, and one of the most important men in the world of Marcus Aurelius. If the transcript is to be believed in its full dramatic logic, he was the kind of man Rome produced only in moments when ordinary political talent was no longer enough. A man for whom war was not theater, but mathematics written in hunger-frost supply lines and dead bodies. The empire needed that kind of man, because by the year 166 AD, Rome was no longer the serene marble giant later imagination prefers. It was breaking. That is where the story must start, not with heroism, but with structural failure. The Roman Empire still stretched from Britannia to the east, still claimed universal dominance, still possessed roads, laws, cities, aqueducts, taxes, and the exhausting self-confidence of a civilization that had been teaching others to kneel for generations. But inside that vast machine, rot had begun to spread. The Antonine Plague, carried west by troops returning from war in the east, was cutting through the empire like an invisible army. Millions died, cities thinned, garrisons weakened. The treasury bled. Confidence did not disappear overnight, but it was no longer effortless. And across the Danube, the enemies of Rome sensed this change before many Romans allowed themselves to admit it. The tribes of the north, the Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians, and others were no longer moving as isolated raiders, striking a frontier and vanishing back into forest and plain. For the first time in generations, they were cohering. Not a random storm, a confederation. A political military mass, beginning to understand that the empire before them was vulnerable enough to wound. This matters because Rome's strength had always depended not just on military efficiency, but on psychological permanence. Frontier peoples were supposed to believe that Rome could absorb any blow and return one larger. Once that belief weakens, a border becomes a testing ground. The transcript gives this rising threat a leader named Balamar, and whether we treat him as one specific historical figure or as a dramatic embodiment of the Confederation's will, his function in the story is crucial. He leads not a raid, but the largest northern invasion the empire had seen in centuries. The Danube freezes, the tribes cross, forts are overwhelmed, legions are mauled. For the first time in a long time, Italy itself no longer feels abstractly protected by distance and imperial prestige. This is not a crisis at the edge. It is the possibility of a tear in the whole fabric. And on the throne sits Marcus Aurelius, philosopher-emperor, the man remembered for meditations on self-command and reason, now forced by history into a role he would never have chosen for himself. He does not need flatterers. He needs a weapon. He needs someone who can understand collapse without becoming part of it. That is where Marcus Nonius Macrinus enters. The contrast with the fictional Maximus matters and should stay sharp. Macrinus was not a humble frontier farmer elevated by merit alone into imperial intimacy. He was born into one of the richest and most connected aristocratic families of northern Italy, likely around Brixia. And his rise followed the great Roman cursus of power. He had already been quaestor dealing with finance, praetor exercising judicial authority, consul, the old Republican summit preserved as imperial prestige, and most importantly, governor of Pannonia, one of the most volatile provinces on the Danube frontier. This last detail is everything. He was not simply a well-born court insider who happened to wear armor when necessary. He knew the border. He knew the peoples beyond it. He knew the rhythms of the land, the shape of the passes, the vulnerabilities of Roman positions, the psychology of enemies who lived outside the tax and road logic of empire. He did not see a faceless barbarian fog. He saw clan structures, rivalries, opportunistic violence, and the possibility of exploiting those things if he survived long enough to do it. This is what made him different. His greatest weapon was not his personal bravery in the romantic sense. It was that he could look at chaos and find structure. By the time Marcus Aurelius called him into intimate service, the situation was already desperate enough that lesser men proposed only fear disguised as prudence. Retreat deeper. Abandon provinces. Pull back the line. Save Italy by conceding the world beyond the Alps and the Danube. This is a classic late imperial instinct before the late empire properly exists. Sacrifice the frontier to save the heart. Macrinus saw the poison in that logic immediately. Retreat would not calm the storm. It would validate it. Once the Northern Confederation understood that Rome no longer intended to defend the line, every tribe and enemy on every other frontier would smell weakness too. The empire's greatest asset, its appearance of permanence, would fracture. So Macrinus offered an answer that was colder than heroism and far more useful. Do not seek one glorious, decisive battle. Bleed them. Deny them certainty. Deny them pace. Deny them food. Force them to experience the frontier not as a gate opening into Roman wealth, but as a zone of endless attrition. In that sense, his first great act is conceptual. He reframes the war from invasion and response into system against system. But he cannot apply that system until he solves the more immediate problem, the Roman army itself. This part of the transcript is especially strong and deserves to remain central. Macrinus does not inherit an army in the heroic classical sense. He inherits an open wound. More than 30,000 men, perhaps yet thinned by plague, weakened by hunger, exhausted by fear, and led in part by officers whose cowardice or incompetence now threatens the army as much as any enemy beyond the river. This is one of the hardest truths in command. When morale dies, the army is already partly in enemy hands. Macrinus understands that speeches about glory will not touch men who no longer believe tomorrow exists. So his first campaign is internal. He cleans the officer corps with what the transcript calls surgical cruelty. He makes examples of men whose fear spreads downward through rank. He turns cowardice itself into a punishable contagion. This is not pleasant leadership. It is effective leadership under catastrophic conditions. Terror of failure inside the ranks must become stronger than terror of the invader outside them. And then he does something even more revealing. He becomes a logistician. That may sound less dramatic than battlefield command, but it is exactly where serious generals begin. He addresses food, bedding, shelter, water, basic health engineering camp, order the material texture of survival. This matters because a starving army cannot be talked into greatness for long. A soldier fed hot bread, given dry straw, and allowed a night without filth around him is not merely more comfortable. He becomes capable again of imagining a future in which obedience is rational. Macrinus knows that morale is never purely emotional. It is nutritional, spatial, habitual. He rebuilds the army's confidence by rebuilding the daily conditions under which confidence becomes possible. The fictional Maximus inspires men by charisma. The real Macrinus, if we follow the transcript's logic, inspires them first by making life survivable enough that faith in command can return. Only then does he attack the imagination. He understands that the northern enemy appears invincible, partly because the Roman mind has already begun granting it monstrous proportions. So he reframes the war. No longer the barbarian horde in the abstract. Now it is a threat to wives' children. Farms, altars, roads, the recognizable fabric of life. The Danube frontier ceases to be an imperial line on a map and becomes the door to every soldier's own home. This is psychologically brilliant because it replaces abstract empire with intimate survival. Men do not fight hardest for administrative continuities. They fight hardest when the enemy has been brought mentally into the private spaces of their lives. Macrinus forges not optimism, but fury. And fury, unlike optimism, can survive cold. The first test of that new army comes at Asali, a vital outpost controlling a mountain pass. The details here are important because they reveal his style in miniature. A garrison of about 500 Romans, under a commander named Tullus, faces roughly 10,000 Marcomanni. Standard Council says, sacrifice the fort, preserve the main army. Do not walk into the mountain ambush, clearly being prepared. It is rational advice. It is also fatal in a deeper sense. Macrinus sees immediately that if he abandons Asali, everything he has just rebuilt inside the army collapses. The men will conclude that all the new steel in their spine was a lie, that they are still expendable pieces in a failing machine. So he refuses the logic of acceptable sacrifice, but he also refuses to walk into the obvious trap. That combination, moral refusal and tactical refusal, is what makes him dangerous. His answer is a forced march of around 80 kilometers in 36 hours. Through terrain the enemy considers unusable forest, swamp, frozen foothills. He takes perhaps 3,000 men, including elite cohorts and Gallic auxiliary cavalry, leaves the main camp appearing unchanged, and races silently for the enemy's rear. Again, the key is not bravery in isolation. It is asymmetry. He will not relieve Asali by pushing head-on through the choke point the enemy wants. He will arrive where the enemy has not bothered to secure, because the enemy cannot imagine a Roman column appearing there at all. And then, when the Marcomanni launch their final assault on the fort, believing victory is seconds away, Macrinus strikes. Fire in the rear, tents collapsing, cavalry harassment creating exaggerated impressions of force, confusion. Then the disciplined advance of legionaries as the garrison itself surges outward from the front. Hammer and anvil executed through speed and timing rather than overwhelming numbers. The result is not a battle so much as controlled destruction. Thousands of Marcomanni dead. Roman losses light. The fort saved. The army reborn through proof rather than promise. This victory matters beyond its tactical scale because it sends two messages in opposite directions. To the Romans, the new command works. To the enemy, the frontier now houses a mind that thinks unlike the frightened and decaying imperial officials you expected to face. The transcript emphasizes that Balamar recognizes this instantly, and that recognition is one of the most interesting psychological turns in the story. A great enemy should never remain a caricature. He sees not merely the loss of a subordinate force, but the signature of a dangerous opponent. A commander who uses speed, surprise, and manipulation of expectation as weapons equal to steel. So the Northern Confederation escalates. What comes next is no longer a testing raid or a campaign of pressure. It is migration and annihilation logic combined. Over 200,000 warriors, we are told, with families, wagons, cattle behind them. This detail matters because it changes the nature of the war. They are not marching simply to plunder and retreat. They are coming to stay, which means they are also bringing a logistical vulnerability. No ordinary raiding army carries mouths baggage and the emotional burden of an entire people in motion. Macrinus understands immediately that his old method will no longer suffice. Quick strikes like Assali are brilliant against concentrated tactical errors. They do not stop a civilization-sized wave. He cannot fight the Confederation in open battle. He cannot simply lock himself behind fortresses because the Horde can bypass static points, strip the countryside, and make the defended places irrelevant. So now he makes the decision that every conventional Roman instinct would resist. He retreats, but not in panic, in design. He orders a generalized evacuation of the frontier and a scorched earth withdrawal southward. Forts abandoned, towns emptied, wells contaminated, food burned or taken, the land itself weaponized. This is perhaps the most important strategic decision in the whole story, because it marks the full maturity of his command mind. He is willing to surrender the appearance of strength in order to preserve strength itself. He will not defend soil for vanity, if doing so destroys the army that might still save the empire later. Instead, he forces the invader to advance through a province that has already been turned against him. The beauty and horror of this decision lie in how it attacks the enemy's cohesion rather than simply its men. A warrior can suffer. A migrating people cannot suffer indefinitely without beginning to crack. Macrinus is no longer fighting only armed men at the front. He is fighting the social body behind them, children wagons, herds, hungry dependents. Every kilometer gained by the Confederation now costs it more than it yields. Towns are empty. Water is foul. Fodder is gone. Cattle die. Hunger starts not at the edge, but in the center of the column. A conquering wave becomes an exhausted procession. This is what makes Macrinus so formidable. He does not insist on winning where victory would look most glorious. He insists on winning where the enemy's structure can be made to decay fastest. Of course, this costs Roman morale too. The soldiers march backward with the enemy still visible behind them. They hear the horns of those they are supposed to be protecting the empire from. They watch land being conceded, villages emptied, fortresses left. To many, this must have looked like the abandonment of Rome's whole self-image. Yet Macrinus holds them together because he knows something the enemy does not yet know. Retreat is shaping a battlefield not yet reached. He is looking for a place where numbers cease to matter in the same way. The transcript gives him that place near Aquileia, in a valley constrained by terrain and river, wide enough to lure the horde, narrow enough to break its breadth with flanks that can be used to close later. Whether one treats every geographical detail literally or reads it as a dramatized compression of frontier campaigning, the underlying strategic logic is sound. He needs the enemy extended, hungry, overconfident, and forced into ground where his own fortification and flanking reserves can function as a machine. So he halts, he turns, and he orders the legions to dig. This is where Roman warfare becomes most itself. Ditches, ramparts, sharpened stakes, controlled killing zones. The men who thought they were fleeing now realize the retreat had a destination all along. This is psychologically explosive. Nothing restores confidence like discovering that humiliation had meaning. The army which had marched backward now begins to transform the valley into a slaughterhouse with their own hands. Every ditch is a promise. Every stake is an argument. Every shovel blow says this is where they die. On the other side, Balamar gives his own speech. He appeals to hunger-children revenge and the promised land beyond the Roman line. That too is intelligent. Desperate people can be made ferocious by the belief that one final breakthrough ends all misery. The first assaults come with the full weight of need behind them. And here, Macrinus's preparation does its work. Stakes take the first bodies. Uneven ground and river break momentum. Missile fire scythes into the advancing mass before it can settle into effective contact. By the time the leading warriors reach the Roman wall, they have already paid a terrible price for the privilege of dying nearer to it. Yet sheer mass still carries them on. The battle turns into brutal close-quarter fighting against the rampart line. What separates Macrinus from lesser commanders here is that he does not confuse success in defense with completion. He has built the valley not merely to hold, but to channel. Once the enemy is fully committed, once the pressure and desperation have pushed the horde deeper into constriction, he triggers the final movement. Roman forces hidden or held in reserve on the surrounding heights crash into the exposed flanks and rear. This is the true trap. The front had always been the bait. Now the Confederation discovers it is not storming a Roman line. It is trapped inside a basin of death with disciplined infantry in front and fresh Roman force on the sides and behind. Panic spreads with astonishing speed because unlike a professional field army, the horde carries its whole vulnerable body inside the same space. Men see families behind them. Wagons jam. Animals scream. Escape routes vanish. The Confederation stops acting like an army and becomes a terrified population under military pressure. That is exactly the transformation Macrinus has been seeking since the beginning of the retreat. Then Balamar makes his final decision. He aims not at the Roman line broadly, but at the Roman mind. Kill the architect, break the center by beheading its intelligence. It is a heroic move and a doomed one. His charge smashes secondary obstacles and drives hard toward the Roman standard, but there he meets what the transcript calls the Praetorian Guard, or at least an elite body of disciplined defenders. The symbolism matters more than the precise unit title. The king who united the tribes dies not in a grand duel, but under the boring, efficient certainty of multiple Roman spears. Once he falls, the last chance at cohesion dies with him. The invasion collapses. The empire is safe. That is the official ending. But the more interesting ending is what kind of heroism this story preserves. Hollywood gave us Maximus, a man of private virtue, betrayed affection and revenge purified into sacrifice. The transcript insists on something harsher and in many ways more Roman. The real model, if Marcus Nonius Macrinus is to carry this narrative weight, is not a hero of personal grievance at all. He is a hero of duty shaped into ruthlessness by necessity. He does not avenge a murdered family. He does not seek noble death in the arena. He calculates purges, feeds, marches, burns, retreats, fortifies, traps, and kills. He saves Rome not by being morally beautiful, but by understanding that civilization, when genuinely under threat, is often preserved by men willing to become colder than those who attack it. That is why the story resonates so strongly beneath the fictional surface. Because behind Maximus lies not a simpler truth, but a more disturbing one. The empire did not survive its darkest frontier crisis because of personal honor alone. It survived because someone knew how to unleash methodical hell before chaos could inherit the world. And that is a much more Roman story.